Okay, we're turning to Revelation chapter 6 this morning. I'm not sure if it's going to come up on your screen. It's going to come up on your screen. I've just had a nod as we read. So Revelation chapter 6. And as we begin to read, let's remember we're at the throne. We're in this scene that John sees in his vision of the throne room of God. And we began that vision in chapter 4. And last week we saw how John was heartbroken. John is heartbroken because nobody can approach the throne of God, and nobody can take from the right hand of God the plan of salvation, the plan to redeem the creation. Don't forget, all of creation is pictured there before the throne of God, isn't it? The four living creatures kind of picture all of creation. And but nobody can come, nobody can redeem this creation that's fallen under the curse of sin and evil, and so John is devastated. But then someone says, look, one of the elders says to John, look, someone is worthy. Look at the Lion of Judah, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And when John looks, he doesn't see a lion, he sees a slain lamb. Jesus has overcome, he is worthy. And so the lamb comes forward, and he takes the scroll from the hand of God, and he begins to open the plan of salvation, the plan of the salvation of the whole world. And so as we come into chapter 6, the Lamb is beginning to open the scroll, and he's got 7 seals to open first. This is a vision, and everything in this vision gives us a bit of information. It's not something that has actually happened in history in the way that it's pictured here, and it's not something that is ever going to happen as it's pictured here. This is something that is happening all the time through history. That's what we're going to learn this morning. So what you're reading is something that is revealing what is happening all the time in human history. That's what we're reading about as these 7 seals are open, and I think we're probably only going to have time to get through 6 of them this morning as we read Revelation chapter 6. So Revelation chapter 6. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a loud voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. When the Lamb opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd living creature say, "Come." Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. When the Lamb opened the 3rd seal, I heard the living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hand. Then I heard what sounded like a voice among the 4 living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. When the Lamb opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over 1/4 of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. When he opened the 5th seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they maintained. They called out in a loud voice, "How long, sovereign Lord, holy and true, until you judge the inhabitants of the earth and avenge our blood?" Then each of them was given a white robe, and they were told to wait a little longer until the full number of their fellow servants, their brothers and sisters, were killed just as they had been. I watched as he opened the 6th seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair, the whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to the earth as figs drop from a tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes and the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves among the rocks of the mountains. They called on the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come." and who can withstand it? Well, part of my glittering CV, in fact the beginning of my glittering and glamorous CV, is the 6 or 7 years I did as a newspaper delivery boy in the Fishpool area of Bury. It was quite a weight of responsibility, I can tell you, delivering news to people in those days. Before it pinged on people's phones, they would be eagerly waiting for their newspaper to come, and so that they could read the news. Do you remember those days? You had to wait for the newspaper to arrive to see the headlines. I can remember the headlines in those days reporting the death of Freddie Mercury, and the headlines reporting Operation Desert Storm in Iraq, and the election of the first Russian president who was elected by means of democracy, Boris Yeltsin, back in the 1990s. And I can remember the reports of the troubles in the Balkans, and the opening of the Channel Tunnel, and the creation of Dolly, the cloned sheep, the troubled life and death of Lady Diana. I can remember all those things from being a paper boy. Doesn't work in quite the same way nowadays, does it? Our headlines, as I said, get delivered straight to our phones. But nevertheless, the truth behind the truths of all of the headlines that we read are being revealed here as we read Revelation chapter 6. And as I've already said, we've come to this point where John is at this point of tragedy. He's at this point of crying and mourning and wailing, because God has got this plan of salvation, but nobody is worthy to take it and to enact it in his creation. And then the Lion of Judah steps forward looking like a lamb who has been slain. He stands in the center of the throne and he opens the plan of salvation. He opens the plan for creation. And you know, as Jesus opens these scrolls, as the lamb, the slain lamb, opens these seals on this scroll, what we're being shown is this is the truth behind the truth. This is the revealing of the truth behind the headlines. And so we're thinking about how life is this morning, and why life is how it is. It's, again, when we read Revelation, it can be quite heavy. And so we're looking at a picture of life in reality, the reality behind life. And so with each seal that's opened is another reality that sits behind all of the headlines that we read. And not just the headlines that we read, but the things that happen in our own lives as well. And so let's begin to look through these 7 seals. The first seal in verse 1 says, I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, Come. I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Notice first of all that this is the 4 living creatures that are calling what is known as the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, calling them forward, bringing them into reality. And don't forget that these 4 living creatures represent the creation, led of course by the human race. And so the first thing to notice, really, I suppose, before we begin to get into some of these dark and difficult things that the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse bring to our attention, the first thing to notice is that it's the human race that is calling these things forward. One of the details of this picture of the throne in Revelation that we must not miss before we get into some of the heavier stuff is to say that the creation is calling these forward, and I think that we're supposed to understand from this that this is reminding us that it was the human race that invited evil into the world. It was the human race that colluded with the enemy of God, the enemy of life, the enemy of goodness and righteousness and peace. It was the human race that agreed that God wasn't on our side and that he wanted harm to us, and so agreed to go against him and work in unity with his enemy. It's the 4 living creatures that call this devastation forward. And so the white horse comes forward first, called forth by the creation, led by the human race. The first rider comes riding over human history. Here's one of the great realities that lies behind all of life, that lies behind my life and your life and the life of the world. On the big stage and on the little stage. In my front room and in the White House and the Kremlin and at the United Nations. Here's one of the great realities behind life. One of the awful realities behind life. And maybe you can see what this rider on the white horse is supposed to be telling us. He had a bow in his hand. He's ready for war. And he's given a crown. He's got some authority. And he rides out as a conqueror bent on conquest. Here's the truth. The desire to dominate, the desire to be in control over, the desire to put down another and subjugate them so I can have authority over them is going to permeate all of human life as we know it. In fact, it does, doesn't it? We know that it does, both on a global scale and on an individual level. We're all aware of embattled relationships, aren't we? Maybe even now you are aware of an embattled relationship that you're in, and maybe you're completely the victim of that, and if you are, then I sympathise and I know how you feel, and that's very difficult, but very often we can also find ourselves, can't we? And maybe we also have memories of times when we realise that we've been too domineering, where we've been too controlling, where we've thought that the only way that this situation, this conflict is ever going to get resolved is if I win. That tends to be the way we think, isn't it? And if it appears likely that I'm going to win, I'm much more likely to want a battle. That's how humans are. Jesus said it like this: you will hear wars, you will hear of wars and rumours of wars, but the end will not come. This is how life is. Maybe you know the story of how, this is a contested story, but there's some truth in it, and haven't got time to go into the detail of it, but maybe you know the story that just before the outbreak of the Second World War, or around the time of the outbreak of the Second World War, a series of German generals wrote a letter to the British Foreign Office offering to assassinate Adolf Hitler, saying that they could end the Second World War before it even had begun, really, by taking him out, that they'd realised what the problem was and they were prepared to remove him so that there could be peace in Europe. And the British Foreign Office and the War Department decided to say, no thank you, we're ready for war now. Maybe you're not surprised to hear that story. All of life is influenced. We are influenced, aren't we, by this desire to dominate. We've got an appetite for war. It's part of our nature. It's intrinsic to us. And then the second rider comes forward. This one's read in verse 3. When the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. This is the second horseman of the apocalypse, the red rider. And his rider is given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. And here is the end result of our desire for dominion over one another. It's bloodshed. He who lives by the sword will die by the sword. Another way of saying it. There is no peace while human fights human, and family fights family, and nation fights nation for dominion over the other. The rider on the red horse is called forth to show John, and it's recorded here to show us that death follows this desire for dominion. Wherever this white horse goes, the red horse follows. That's the logical outcome, and the natural partner of the inclination of my heart is death. Told you it was heavy this morning. Maybe that will make us hesitate next time we say, I'll show him. I'll show her. They need to know who's boss. The human desire for dominion is a bloody affair every time. And this is the path we tread when we believe that the solution to our problems is the dominion or the subduing of that enemy, that I have the victory. If I'm given the victory here, everything will be okay. It's a lie. It's being exposed here. It's being revealed as a lie. It's being unmasked for the evil that it is. And then the black horse follows as the third seal is opened. Verse 5, when the Lamb opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a black horse. Its rider was holding a pair of scales in his hands. And then I heard what sounded like a voice among the four living creatures saying, 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages, and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages, and do not damage the oil and wine. What's this all about? Well, we could say that black symbolizes mourning. We know that that's true, and that logically follows on from the previous two riders, doesn't it? But in addition here, we're mainly being told about economic hardship. We're being told about economic dominion. We're being told about how the rich dominate the poor, keep them poor. And the scales symbolize commerce and business in the ancient world. And this desperate cry comes out in verse 6. What's being described here is what we might call hyperinflation. 2 pounds of wheat for a day's wages and 6 pounds of barley for a day's wages. This is inflation of at least eightfold. So some bread would cost a day's wages. That's what we're being told. And so it's something like 10 or 12, somewhere between 8 and 16 times what its ordinary street value should be. And the poor are being priced out of the market. That's what's happening in this picture. And here's another way that humans take dominion over each other. It's through financial dominion, isn't it? The rich keeping the poor where they are. It's very interesting to read about the potential economic wealth of a continent like Africa, but how Africa over many decades now has been, or many centuries now, has been plundered by richer nations, many of them European, and how that keeps the African nations impoverished. And whilst they are a resource-rich nation, they never quite managed to get their hands on the wealth. The people never quite managed to get the hands on the wealth, and they're kept poor, millions kept in poverty in just that one continent of the world, and that's not the only place where that happens. And so many in this town of Radcliffe understand the trap of poverty, how they get into debt just to have the staples of life. The staples of life are too expensive. The roof over the head. It's pictured here with wheat and barley, just your normal food. But we know, don't we, about food poverty for children growing up. And how families can't afford, because they've got to pay increasing levels of rent and increasing money for their energy bills to keep the house warm and so on, that in the end it has an impact on just the staples of life. Bread is too expensive. And then this warning comes, do not damage the oil and the wine. What's happening there? The rich are saying, don't damage our wealth, don't damage our luxury. Don't do anything to affect our oil and our wine. Those are luxury goods, but all the time the staples of life are being made too expensive for the poor. And we're being told here this is another essential aspect of life amongst humans. This is what we called forward when we said no to God, when we said no to the creation as He had made it. We called forward the economic systems of this world that favour the rich while we fleece the poor. Martin Luther King saw this, and having known a measure of success in his attempts at racial justice, was beginning to turn his attention to the wider issues of economic injustice. And so in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was planning the Poor People's March on Washington. And he planned to gather poor people of all colours in Washington to present themselves to the rich and powerful in the White House and the surrounding seat of power in Washington, forcing them to realise the needs of the poor and to address the economic injustice of the financial systems of the world. And he said we ought to come in mule carts, in old trucks, and any kind of transportation that people can get their hands on. People ought to come to Washington, sit down if necessary in the middle of the street and say, we are here, we are poor, we don't have any money, you have made us this way, and we've come to stay until you do something about it. And many consider that it was around this time that Martin Luther was going to take his significant influence and his abilities as a leader and take them to challenge the economic injustice, the rider on the black horse, the economic injustice that there was in America at the time, that was making many rich while others remained trapped in poverty. But it was around that time that Martin Luther Jr. was considered to have overstepped the mark. And Martin Luther King Jr. never made it to the March for the Poor, because in the early evening of the 4th of April in Memphis, Tennessee, Martin Luther King was shot dead. Do not challenge our black horse. These are the realities that sit behind life. The desire for dominion, the bloodshed that follows, economic injustice. It's all happening before the face of God, called forward by the human race. And then we come to the next rider, the fourth horseman of the apocalypse, the pale horse, death. Verse 7 and 8, when the Lamb opened the fourth seal, I heard the voice of the fourth living creature say, come. I looked, and there before me was a pale horse. Its rider was named Death, and Hades was following close behind him. They were given power over a fourth of the earth to kill by sword, famine, and plague, and by the wild beasts of the earth. This is how it all plays out. Death is rampant in the world because we have called it forth. The rider on the pale horse is the logical conclusion of all of this. Church, we do not need to look out of the window to see when the four horsemen of the apocalypse are going to arrive. We see them in the headlines all the time. These are not real characters who are going to turn up at the end. We don't need to keep a weather eye open on Holcomb Hill for these four riders to come galloping down from the hills in the north. No, these are the characteristics of fallen humanity that are being revealed here. It's the four living creatures who call each of these riders forward, as I've reminded us as we've gone through. Life on planet Earth is being revealed, the human character, both in the way we set our societies up and the way we interact on an individual basis. This is who we are. Turn on the news channel and you'll be able to see evidence of the white horse, of domination over one another. And you'll be able to see evidence of the red horse, of war and bloodshed. And you'll be able to see all the evidence you need of economic injustice and the power of the black horse. And you will see plenty of evidence of the pale horse on the rampage at the moment, continuing to make its mark, their dirty marks on God's good creation. And as we've already noted, it's not only out there, is it? It's also in here. I summon these riders of the apocalypse all too often. It's in my nature to call them forth when I'm backed into a corner, when I feel that I've been hard done to in some way. Have you seen it in you as well? So 4 seals have been opened so far. The horsemen are riding forth. This is how life is. This is how we are. And then we see next how God responds. Revelation chapter 6 verse 9 to 17 with the opening of the 5th and the 6th seal. I think we're going to leave the sermon there for now. I'm not going to take it any further. I think that we need to really consider, church, as we begin to draw to a close, how these 4 characters that are called forth, how they manifest themselves in our lives. I think we need to spend some time considering what that means for us. But as we do, we need to consider again, church, that the Lamb has overcome. That it is the Lamb that sits on the throne. None of these 4 horsemen of the apocalypse sit on the throne. They're called forth by the human race into this scene, and none of them have dominion in the end. They are given some power, they're given a sword, but they're also limited. The rider on the pale horse, death, is given power over a fourth of the earth, not over the entire earth. And we're going to see as we go through Revelation chapter 6, 7 and 8 in the coming days how God limits this suffering. Part of God's response to all of this is to limit it. We have called it forward and God has promised to limit it. And consider again as we draw to a close that the Lamb has overcome, that on that day outside Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, hell and evil threw its worst at God, at the Son of God as he hung on that cross. Like the rider on the white horse, they dominated him with mocking and whips and nails and a cross of wood. Summoning the rider on the red horse, they brought death to him. Ride forth the black horse as they strip him of all his worldly possessions, leaving him naked and exposed. They cast lots for his garments, a pretty penny to be raised on the clothes of a miracle worker. And behind them all the pale rider, death, who brought with him hell. And the forces of hell ravaged the body, mind, and soul of God the Son as he dies on the cross, telling him that the Father had abandoned and forsaken him and that the good of God was not for him. Have you heard those words before? God is not for you, God is against you. The good that God has is not for you. Jesus heard those words on the cross too, as the rider on the pale horse, death and hell, accused him. God is not for you, and Jesus cried out, didn't he? My God, why have you forsaken me? Do you see the pale horse assailing our King on the cross? Humanity did its worst. The riders, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, these four characteristics of humanity, fallen humanity, we did our worst to that King on that day, and hell joined in, but the Lamb overcame. And on the third day he rose again. Death and violence and evil and poverty and dishonesty and evil do not have eternal life. The Lamb does. Life is in his hands, and he gives it all to those who come to him. Church, this week, beware of your natural inclination to call forth the four horsemen of the apocalypse to win your wars for you. And remember that the Lamb shows us a different path. Follow him in self-giving. It's a path that will see you lose out in this life. It's not for nothing that he said foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. It's a path that will see you feel and mourn the reality of sin and evil in this world and be really troubled by it as he was, whilst others seem to live every day as a party, getting richer and wealthier and happier as they go along. But it's not for nothing that our King said, in this world you will have trouble. It's not for nothing that he was called the man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. You can expect that if you're going to follow him, you too will be acquainted with grief. It's a path, if we follow the path of the Lamb, it's a path that today will see more people killed in his name. But it's not for nothing that he said, if anyone will follow after me, let him take up his cross and follow me. It's a difficult path to follow while the four horsemen of the apocalypse are abroad. But it's the only path that will lead us safely to eternal life and the renewed creation that he has guaranteed with his life, death and resurrection. Church, continue to follow Jesus.